Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode in our walkthrough of chapters of this very fine giant book that I spent the 1990s writing, and that will have its 20th anniversary on May 14th. We've been going through week by week different chapters of the book. We are at week 10 and we are looking at chapter 10. And the subject of this chapter is processes of perception and analysis. Last week, we talked about fundamental physics. Before that, about kind of systems, implications for everyday systems. In a sense, one of the questions that I was trying to answer in a new kind of science is, where does all this complicated stuff that happens in nature come from? And so one of the things that comes up when you ask that kind of question is, what do you mean by complicated stuff? What do you mean by that's complex? That looks complicated. What does that mean? And the story of what that means is really a story of observers and a story of how what happens in the world, what happens in some simple model of the world is perceived by an observer. And that's what chapter 10 is really about. It's about perception analysis. It's about how the observer perceives things from behavior that occurs either in the natural world or in a computational system. Now, I have to say that I haven't thought that much about the contents of chapter 10 until very recently. Chapter 10 has recently become a big focus because in working on our physics project, we've come to understand that the observer is much more critical than I ever imagined. I was interested in a new kind of science in NKS, in the observer as kind of a way to kind of be able to make definitions about what was going on in a computational system. We now realize that the observer is what, in a sense, defines the kinds of laws that one deduces are happening in a system like our physical world. So recently, I've been interested in the development of what I call observer theory, which is really going to be something built very much on what was in chapter 10 of New Kind of Science. So let's take a look here at what was in the book. So here we are, chapter 10, Processes of Perception and Analysis. It's kind of a, in the sequence of the book, just to give kind of the global architecture, the early part of the book kind of talks about what's out there in the computational universe. You have simple rules that define a program, you run the program, what kinds of things happen. Then the middle part of the book, chapters 7, 8, and 9, are really about, okay, so given that, so looking at things in the world, how do those correspond to, how does their behavior and how does their structure and mechanism correspond to what we see in these simple programs that we looked at earlier in the book. Chapter 10 is kind of an intermediate step between these things where we say, well, we can see what happens in the real world, compare it to a program, and working towards kind of the general principle that is kind of the crowning part of the book, the principle of computational equivalence. These questions about processes of perception and analysis are going to be needed in the NKS book as a way to kind of define what will be the principle of computational equivalence. Essentially, what we have to be able to say is, when I say something looks complicated, what does that mean? Is there a hard definition of complexity, randomness, and so on, and how does that work? Okay, so let's dive into the section on processes of perception analysis. And I have to admit that it's been a while since I looked in detail at this chapter. What we're talking about here is, just as the process of creating a system in nature is something that we can expect to model, for example, with simple rules corresponding to some simple program, so also the process of perceiving or analyzing what we see in nature is also something that we can expect to look at that we can expect to model with programs. And so what I'm kind of launching with here is describing how it is that we do, how we can expect to model the process that goes from sort of the thing we have out there in the real world to our perception of that thing. Okay, so I talk here about what do perception analysis do? So we basically, what they do to be able to make use of all the data that we are bombarded with, I point out, we have to reduce it to more manageable proportions. And that's what perception analysis try to do. I say their role in effect is to take large volumes of raw data and extract from it summaries that we can use. That's the core idea of perception analysis. Actually, that sort of re-emerged as the core idea of observer theory today. So we can look at a picture like this one here, and we could describe it just in terms of every single pixel, black or white, in the picture. But it's quite easy for us to summarize this picture by just saying that it's made of a bunch of diamond shapes and so on. We don't have to give 24,000 black and white cell specifications. We can just summarize that picture. And that's what perception and analysis do for us. They give us this kind of summary. And what makes it possible to summarize something? Well, in a sense, it's the fact that there are regularities that we perceive in this case, this image. Those regularities mean we don't have to say every detail. We can use sort of the redundancy in the picture to be able to make a simpler summary of the picture. And I just talk about what forms of perception analysis there are, whether they're happening in kind of our sensory system, or whether they're happening in a more computational kind of setting. So one of the questions that is sort of core to the NKS book is the question, when you see something like the Rule 30 pattern, and you're confronted with that pattern, you're just on the screen, you have that picture there, and you're asked the question, given some piece of this pattern, can you perceive that this has a regularity, that this comes from this simple rule, or does this somehow, according to your methods of perception and analysis, just look like a really complicated thing that you have to be sort of told separately came from that simple rule? And so that's sort of a big question of just how powerful can the methods of perception and analysis be? I'm really talking here about the question, this is an example of a two-dimensional cellular automaton, and I'm talking about the question of, for example, would the aliens be able to immediately say, oh, that pattern there, I know that that's a simple thing, it just comes from that simple cellular automaton? Or is it the case that there is something robustly complex about this pattern that would be perceived as complex by any of some collection of entities? I think it's the latter, and this has to do with the whole story of computational irreducibility that I'll cover in much more detail in chapter 12. But here we're just looking at the question, well, how do we go ahead and perceive this particular pattern? What are the rules? What's the program that we use to perceive, to reduce that pattern to a summary that we can readily understand, transmit, store, whatever else? Okay, so sort of the first question here is, when we look at a pattern and we just say, well, that just seems kind of random, what do we mean by that? And so when we have a concept like randomness, it starts as a notion of everyday language. I say here, at the level of everyday language, when we say something seems random, what we usually mean is that there are no significant regularities in it that we can discern, at least with whatever methods of perception analysis we use. So I'm looking here at these pictures, and I'd say that these first two pictures, we wouldn't have said they're random because we, with our visual system, can readily discern patterns in them. Whereas this one here, our visual system does not readily discern what seem to be genuine patterns in this picture. And so it's that's kind of the question of randomness, is the question of, can we readily discern patterns in what's going on? And when we can, it's a sign that there are irregularities. It's a sign that we can specify the picture using less than just the number of the set of bits that we have to give in the picture. So, for example, here there's I don't know what we have to do is some block. I say 49 by 2 block in here. That if we specify that, we just have to say this picture is a repeat of those blocks and so on. And here we have some kind of nested pattern where we just have to say, you take this 3 by 3 block and just do substitutions on it to generate this pattern. So this question of randomness is sort of a question of whether there is a short description that we can find of the pattern. Is there some way we can describe the pattern? Is there some way we can make use of regularities in the pattern to find a short description? So one possibility is to define randomness by saying that there's no short description whatsoever that exists. And if we had such a definition, then everything we have in the NKS book, for example, things like Rule 30, they would fail that definition of randomness. Because even though the center column of Rule 30 may look to us in every intuitive sense random, it still isn't the case that there's no simple rule that produces it. After all, there's Rule 30 that can just be run to produce that pattern. So in a sense, the notion of randomness that says something is random only if there is no conceivable program or description of it that is short compared to the thing itself, that definition of randomness, so-called algorithmic randomness, is something that, in a sense, the NKS book kind of showed wasn't the right pragmatic definition of randomness, because things like Rule 30 completely fail that definition. Like the digits of pi, like lots of other kinds of things, you start from a simple rule and you generate something which for all practical purposes seems random. Now you might say, oh, but we know it isn't random because it's just generated from a simple rule. Well, you may know that if you could figure out what the rule was, but as a practical matter, if we want to understand, for example, the natural world, it may very well be the case that there is something that we consider with respect to all of our measuring approaches to the natural world to be completely random, even though there is some secret mechanism underneath that will generate the thing from a simple rule. So an extreme version of that is our whole universe. In our current model of fundamental physics, developed in the last few years on the basis of what was in chapter 9 of NKS, in that model, in a sense, what we're saying is the whole universe is determined from a simple rule. So if that's the case, then nothing in the universe with the definition of randomness that says there couldn't be a simple rule that made it, then nothing in the universe can ever be considered random. So our definition of randomness has to be a bit more practical and pragmatic. It has to be not, is there a simple program that could conceivably make this thing, but rather, is there a simple program that we can find that describes the thing? And that's a somewhat different question. So, and by the way, there are all kinds of problems if you say, is there a program at all that will generate this string? For example, there are questions about computational irreducibility and undecidability. It's like, well, I've got this string that I want to know, can anything generate it? Well, I've got a bunch of candidate things shorter than that string that try to generate it, a bunch of programs that try to generate it. One of those programs has run for 1 billion steps. It hasn't halted. Maybe after 1,010,000,000 steps, it will suddenly generate that string. And I'll be able to say, yes, that string comes from a simple initial, simple rule. But I can't know, there's no upper bound on the amount of time that could elapse in the attempt to generate that string. And so we can't, as a practical matter, it's not a computable question whether that string is random according to that definition. But in the definition that we're choosing to use, there is a more kind of practical definition of, does it seem random with respect to our actual methods, our actual methods of perception and analysis? That is something that we can expect to be able to answer by considering models of our actual methods of perception and analysis. So let's see, I think what I talk about here is what I'm going to do in this chapter is to look at different methods of perception and analysis that are that work with our eyes and our ears and other kinds of things like that, and try and understand how those, what kind of models we can make of what happens in our eyes and ears and brains and so on, and how we can understand what's happening in terms of the kind of simple programs approach, and what the ability to make those programs for perception and analysis mean in terms of the actual effectiveness of perception and analysis and the definitions of things like randomness. So I talked about randomness, and I used kind of the operational definition that something is random if we can't find a way to describe it in a sort of a compressed fashion. We can't recognize regularities that allow us to give a shorter description of the thing than just to specify its individual bits. That's the definition of randomness that I've been using. So what about complexity? How might we define that? So what I talked about here is a way of defining that. And when we look at these pictures, we might say, well, those first two pictures, yeah, they're kind of random, but how complex are they? For example, it kind of depends a little bit what we want out of these pictures. If what we want to do is to just say, well, roughly what's going on in that picture? A question like, well, are there, is the average number of black and white cells 1/2? Black cells or white cells 1/2? The answer might be, yeah, to a very good approximation, it is just 1/2. So even though the detailed pattern of black and white cells may look kind of random, be very complicated to figure out, still questions like, what's the average blackness level? That has a very easy answer. So in a sense, the definition of complexity, sort of an operational definition, is that the things you want to know are hard to answer. In the case of randomness, what we were saying is, the definition is, if you want to reproduce the thing exactly, how difficult is that? How much information do you need to be able to do that? Well, in the case of complexity, kind of the operational definition is, given a particular thing I want to know, is there a simple description of the system that will answer the question about that? So if all I want to know is average blackness level, that can be very easy to answer in a case like this. In a case like this, it might be much harder to answer, because in a case like this is the rule 110 cellular automaton in this particular case. In a case like this, there may be all kinds of questions about, oh, do these things eventually all take over the system and then it's all got these black stripes? Or does the white thing take over? Or what happens? It's difficult to answer even that overall kind of bulk question of what's the average number of black or white cells. So in a sense, the notion of complexity that I consider to be sort of a pragmatic definition is, can you answer the question that you wanted to answer? And that question may not be the final question, what's the color of every cell? It may be some much more zoomed out question, like what's the average colors of the cells, or something like that. And something we would consider complex if we can't answer those kinds of sort of zoomed out questions that we choose to ask about the system. Okay, so now we can start looking at we can start discussing how we tell. There's a lot of things here about visual perception, and we tell complexity. We know it when we see it, and it's actually I comment here that even below the level of conscious thought, our brains already have a rather definite notion of complexity. When we're presented with a complex image, our eyes tend to dwell on it, presumably in an effort to give our brains a chance to extract a simple definition. So in other words, when we're shown something that seems like it isn't just, oh, that's just purely random, that's the summary we're going to give of it. When it seems like there's something going on there that we should be able to find a description of, that's where we start. That's where our brains kind of engage, and that's sort of a signal of complexity. Well, and I say here, when there's perfect randomness, we tend to lose interest. But complexity is sort of the interesting case, so to speak. So let's see. All right. So basically, what I've been doing here, and let me go back and look at some notes for these previous sections. Boy, these are not long in the notes. Okay, so we're talking about the definition of randomness. We talk about algorithmic information theory. this idea that you look at the simplest possible program to generate a particular kind of thing that has this undecidability, impracticability issue, but also operationally, what I argue in NKS is that's not what we should care about for studying natural science. Because what we care about for studying natural science is with our actual methods of perception analysis that we, quotes, naturally use, what conclusion do we come to? Not in principle, could one find a program, but in practice, can we find a program? Okay, this is about the history of definitions of randomness, featuring various kinds of questions about probability, questions about that really started in the 1960s was the origination of this idea of using computation as a way to think about the phenomenon of randomness, and my friend Greg Chaitin was deeply involved in that. I talk here about the question of, if you think you have something random, are there, and you think you see a regularity, is that regularity significant? And a phenomenon in mathematics, Ramsey theory, is a case where there are certain kinds of regularities that you just can't get away from. They just have to happen. They're things that, even if things are sort of perfectly randomly distributed, even if sort of all possible cases occur, it's still, if you make the right definition for what you're looking at, there will be certain kinds of regularities which are inevitable. And this is kind of a rather nice, simple example of the fact that certain kinds of, for example, arithmetic sequences, simply there just has to be, by just a sort of combinatorial argument, there has to be some such regularity, quotes regularity, even though there isn't, it's an inevitable thing. It's not something that really gives you information that there is such a regularity. Okay, this is talking about history of definitions of complexity. This is kind of a messy subject, actually. This idea of complexity as a kind of a concept, as a sort of a disembodied concept, is something that I guess I was quite involved in introducing in the 1980s. I'm not sure that in all respects that it was sort of an optimal way of this, that the sociology or something of that science was perfectly optimized. But this idea that sort of complexity is a thing, as opposed to just complexity being a failure, so to speak, was something that really arose in the 1980s, and that I was much involved in kind of popularizing. Let's see, I think I talk here about the twists and turns of sort of attempts to define complexity in a sense. And essentially, there are a lot of places where people say, I nailed it, I got a definition of complexity. It's always nonsense. In a sense, complexity is just an impression that we have. I tried to give sort of a qualitative description just now of complexity is what happens when even the question you wanted to ask about a system is hard to specify an answer to. That's the sort of operational definition. But when you say, okay, I'm going to turn that into a piece of math, there are the sort of the thing that goes between that and the math, so to speak, is, well, what kind of question did you ask, and how did you ask it? And that really gets us centrally into the business of chapter 10 and these questions about the nature of perception analysis and the processes of perception analysis. Okay, so returning to chapter 10 here, after these kind of discussions about randomness and complexity, we head for a very specific kind of question, which is data compression. And data compression is deeply connected to both our definition of randomness and our definition of complexity. What is data compression? So what we want to do is to have some way to to specify data to use the regularities that exist in data to specify it more compactly than by just giving every bit in the data. So for example, if we have got 53 identical cells, white cells, how do we specify those 53 cells? Well, here at the bottom, we're just giving those 53 cells one after another, or actually 30 cells here. But we know there are much better ways to specify the number 30, for example. We could specify it in unary, just giving 30 tokens here, but we can also do other things. For example, we can use binary. We can specify the number of 30 in binary digits, or we can use other kinds of techniques here to specify the number 30. And we can see that it takes a lot fewer bits to specify the number 30 in binary than it does to specify the number 30 when we just give 30 counters here. So this process of data compression has to do with, can we summarize things in fewer bits than it takes than the actual thing itself. So the first kind of data compression that I talk about here is run length encoding. In run length encoding, what we're doing is we're saying there's a run of identical colors here, and instead of giving all of those colors, all we're going to do is give a binary number that says how many bits there were, how many bits of that color there were. And we just have to give alternating binary numbers because we know that we have a run of black cells, we have a run of white cells, and so on. And so what we're seeing here is these are cases where we're mapping a single black cell onto this sequence, a double black cell onto a double cell onto that sequence, and so on. And these are arranged to be self-delimiting, so that when we just stick these sequences together, we can decode where one of them begins and another one ends. And so we can take this result here and we can say, yes, we can decode that piece into 11, that one into 11, 10, 9. Okay, so in this case, the number of bits necessary in the original specification was larger than the number of bits in the compressed specification. But that's not always the case. For example, with run length encoding, if our runs are short, we can end up actually having to take more bits to specify the run length encoded version of the data than to specify the data itself. Back when I was writing this section, fax machines were still a common thing. And fax machines, when they were scanning a page and transmitting the data on it, they used run length encoding to just not specify that whole run of white pixels. They just said, oh, there are X number of white pixels here. And that was the encoding method that they used. And when there's a lot of white pixels and just small areas of black fonts, that's going to be an efficient thing to do. All right, so, okay, so this is asking for cellular automaton patterns. What does run length encoding do? In a case like this, where there are long runs, run length encoding successfully compresses the pattern. So remember, our definition of, for example, randomness had to do with, can we find a way to compress the pattern into less bits than the pattern itself? Well, the answer here is, well, run length encoding does pretty well for this pattern here. It's doing progressively less well for some of these patterns here. For example, this is a big lose for run length encoding because you keep on having different runs here, and you keep on having to give another specification for every single pixel there. So in a case like this, the run length encoded data is actually significantly longer than the original data from the original system. Okay, so let's see, what do I do next? Okay, the next thing I look at is what's called Huffman coding. And in run length encoding, you're just saying, let's take these runs of bits and specify in binary how long those runs are. In Huffman coding, you're saying, let's take these blocks and depending on the frequencies of these blocks, use short code words for more frequent blocks. So kind of the quintessential example of a coding that's a bit like that is Morse code, where, you know, an E is a dot, a T is a dash. Those are short, and, you know, an S is a ... for example, because it's less common in English. The most common letter, E, is a short code word. And for example, Z, I don't know my Morse code, but Z is probably a four character code. So what Huffman coding is doing is saying, if the block is common, encode it in in a small sequence. If the block is less common, encode it in a longer sequence. So in this case here, we're seeing that the block white, white, white is encoded in a single white cell, whereas the block white, black, black, which is less common, is encoded in black, black, white, white. Okay, so the way this has to work is you first have to specify what the code words that you're going to use are. You have to say, okay, this, you have to, if you're, the code words can be given as numbers in binary, for example, but you have to basically give a listing of, okay, the number 10 means this whole block of cells. So this is now Huffman coding, which is sort of an optimal way of doing this block encoding applied to a particular sequence here, and you can see it successfully compresses it. But in a case like this, because I guess there are a bunch of rare blocks and so on, Huffman coding does quite poorly, and the supposed compression actually makes things longer than the original data. So that's another form of compression. We can now look at how does Huffman coding do on cellular automaton images, and we see in this particular case that we're succeeding in compressing even this image here, and probably we're doing that because there's some local regularities, there's big areas of white here and so on, but this image here still loses with Huffman coding. It's still saying that the image is actually, that it really does look random with respect to Huffman coding. Okay, the final kind of encoding I think that I talked about here is what I call pointer-based encoding, which is sometimes also known as dictionary encoding. It's what's used by programs like Zip and so on. What that does is it says, have I seen this before? Let me record a list of kind of blocks that I've seen before, and sort of keep a cache of the blocks I've seen before, and just keep going and keep specifying things in terms of referring back to what I've seen before. So at the beginning, you just say, well, I've seen this before because it's what the thing begins with. And now you refer back to what you saw before. So in this case here, it works very well to refer back to what you saw before because you're referring to this block here. You just keep referring to the same thing over and over again. In other cases, again, it doesn't work quite so well because you have this sort of more novelty to what you're seeing. And so this idea of just sort of using the dictionary of what you've seen before doesn't work so well. So again, this is, okay, so in the case of a nested sequence, pointer-based encoding works really, really well because basically what's happening is it's saying you've seen this, okay, from that you can build the next level of the nesting and the next level of the nesting, and you can kind of, this pointer-based encoding can crush everything down. Okay, so again, let's try pointer-based encoding for these patterns. And we see that, for example, things like this do pretty well. They really get compressed well. They get compressed about the same as this got compressed. Remember, when we were doing things like run length encoding, this was horrible because run length encoding couldn't kind of recognize the regularity that this is a repeating sequence of black-white cells. But pointer-based encoding can, and pointer-based encoding successfully compresses most of the things here that we can see have visual regularity just in our visual system. But it doesn't succeed in compressing this one that indeed looks more complicated. So, oh boy, this is, I'd forgotten this. This is kind of cool. This is kind of a two-dimensional analog. What we were doing before was we was kind of scanning one-dimensionally and sort of scan lines across the picture. Here we're saying if we take two-dimensional blocks, there's like kind of a quad tree in computer graphics kind of approach, where you're saying, try and cover this thing by blocks. It's kind of like almost at this level, it's kind of almost like run length encoding in 2 dimensions. And we see there's the sort of the big block here that's just pure white. And we see the thing going to try and fill in just those kinds of pieces that it needed. And so again, we can look at what that does for compression. And in this case, we're succeeding in compressing primarily because we don't have these white areas are easy to compress. So that's just yet a different compression method. Okay, this is 2-dimensional block encoding, just yet more compression. This is kind of like just how small can you make it with this kind of compression technique. Let's see. So here, we're using kind of the fanciest compression technique that I discuss in NKS, two-dimensional pointer encoding. This is not something that tends to be used, actually. It's a little bit similar to wavelet transforms. It's kind of a more minimal version of that. But what you see here is we're looking at, this is looking at, have I seen a block like that before? So we're seeing a bunch of white blocks here, and here it's kind of like, it's figuring out that it's seen a bunch of these blocks before. And here it's seeing, because there's a nested pattern, it can figure out that it's seen blocks before, and so it can use much less space. So see how well it compresses something like this or something like this. It compresses it to practically nothing, because these patterns can be sort of readily decomposed into these nested kind of structures. But yet again, in cases, well, in this case, it is succeeding in identifying some of the regularities that come from the fact that this is a Rule 30 pattern. In this case, for example, this is a part of a two-dimensional cellular automaton pattern. It's succeeding in recognizing the fact that there's symmetry in this pattern, and it is successfully compressing it. So this is a pretty good practical method of compression. Only in this case here does it fail to compress it, and does it say, I can't really describe it in less bits than it takes to just write the pattern itself down. So those are all examples. So in these compression methods that we've seen here, one feature that they have is once you've got the compressed data, you can always uniquely go backwards and reproduce the original data from it. So you're using the regularities in the data to specify the data in less bits than the original data itself took. Just like in Morse code, if you see a dot, that's an E, you can go backwards from the Morse code to the original message. Okay, that's reversible data compression. There's also irreversible data compression. We're very familiar with this in practice. Something like a JPEG or a GIF for image compression, it is an irreversible piece of data compression. It captures the part of the image that we care about, but it leaves out the details of the image, the fine detail of individual pixels and so on, that our eyes won't notice. It just says that's irrelevant. I won't bother to capture those, and I'll have a version of the picture that is very compressed, keeping the parts of the picture that I actually care about. So in this case, what we're doing is we're just ignoring parts of the picture that are below a certain resolution. So here we've got a compression based on these two-dimensional subdivisions where we're keeping every subdivided piece. But here we're just sort of saying we're just fuzzing it out. And we're saying, well, we don't really care about the fine detail of what happens here. We just care about the overall fuzzed out version. And that allows us to have compression. So similarly here, the compression is quite dramatic. In this case, where we're keeping every detail, we have this pretty long sequence here, but when we're fuzzed out and only keeping this level of detail of the pattern, in this case, just spatial length scales, we can compress to this level. So this is describing the real question that we have here is, okay, so when we look at a picture, what do we actually notice? We don't notice the pixel by pixel form of the picture, but we do notice sort of large scale features, and we notice certain textures. Just like in our eyes, we have certain detectors for color, red, green, blue cone cells for color. Presumably, we have certain detectors, and this is something I did talk about in the NKS book, we have certain detectors for texture. What are those detectors, and what do we notice? So we can ask, for example, if we look at different possible forms of patterns that we might recognize in a particular pattern, in a particular picture here, we can kind of rank the different forms that occur in these pictures, and then we can ask, based on, okay, so this is saying we decompose every picture. This is kind of like a wavelet transform. We're decomposing pictures into these kind of blocks and these blocks have the feature that they have a certain orthogonality property that means that any picture can eventually be created by a composition of these blocks. But if we just pick these blocks, if we just use these blocks, sort of the coarsest one first, then let's see, how does this work? This is, let's see. Yeah, okay. I'm talking about the fact that JPEG uses an approach much like this. But what we're seeing is that the question is, which of these forms actually occur most often in the picture? So in other words, if we're encoding the picture, we have to sort of say, oh, we've got 3 of this form and we've got 1 of this form. And it's more important to do that than to say how many of this form down here we have. So by ranking these different forms in order of what's perceptually most important, we get to compress, for our purposes, for our visual system's purposes, we get to compress an image. And this is more or less how JPEG compression works. We're keeping just these kind of coarse aspects of the image and not these very fine-grained aspects here. So let's keep going here. Okay, so these are practical examples where we're asking the question, well, does this compression, even though we know that when we're keeping only 1/64th of the forms that we would compose together to get the image, we're only keeping 1/64th of those forms, but for us as humans perceiving the pattern, can we still tell what's going on? Well, we can still read the A and the, well, more or less we can read the A and the B here. By the time we're keeping 1/16th of the bits, we do a pretty good job of reading the A and the B here. We don't do a terribly good job of seeing what's going on in this pattern here. In other words, in this pattern here, even when we allow lossy compression, even though we are saying that something which did a pretty good job of reproducing the A and the B that we wanted to see, the kind of thing that we'd see in sort of everyday life, when we're looking at this kind of generated pattern or this pattern here, it doesn't do a very good job of reproducing that. So in a sense, with respect to this method of perception, we would consider this a complex pattern, because even when it is lossily compressed, even we don't succeed in preserving the pattern with lossy compression. So let's see, what else do we talk about here? Okay, this is using these different sequences, and this is looking at what happens when you just pick these things in sort of an arbitrary, in the order in which they were generated, versus saying, well, what's actually important to us in our visual system? This case, it's the what's actually important. And we can see that when we weight it towards the what's actually important side of things, we get patterns that are recognizable, like these letters, much more quickly with many fewer bits than if we just say, well, just use these in the sort of mathematical order that we computed these things. So again, this is, for us, we have this kind of method of compression that is giving, that is successful. So, okay, so then I talk here about visual perception, and I talk here about how this relates to sort of the way that we perceive things. This is sort of an interesting example. So everybody can see that this is broken into sort of a patchwork, okay? How do we see that? If we were to just measure like the average density of black and white cells, every patch has the same average density of black and white cells. But somehow we notice something in those patches that allows us to distinguish the patches. There is something in our visual system that's recognizing the texture of those patches, and it isn't just saying the average number of black and white cells. Now, there's quite a bit of literature in the world of visual perception. I talk about that in the notes to NKS. I wanted to just give a sketch of sort of a simple model of how that kind of perception might occur as a way to give a sort of model that we could use to assess complexity in the patterns produced by things like simple cellular automata. So the thing that I use is to just say, what happens if we just take a template? We just say our eye is just recognizing white, white, black, black, and we just look at the resulting pattern perceived by sort of a white, white, black, black feature detector. Okay, so then this is showing for different feature detectors what those feature detectors will pick up for these different patterns. And then we can go look at our original textures and we can say, for different feature detectors, what would be picked up in these different textures? And so what we see here is that with 2x2 feature detectors, we can often distinguish, like this particular feature detector down here tells us, oh, there's something different about that piece of the patchwork. These are 3x3 feature detectors, and we can actually get a pretty good job, do a pretty good job of recognizing of sort of what we would call image segmentation these days, of recognizing the different patches of that particular pattern. And by the way, in modern times, and we'll talk about this some more, we can use neural networks and so on to do this kind of thing. But in the end, this is sort of the essential phenomenon that's going on. This is kind of like a convolutional neural net, except that it's a very minimal version of that. And yet, even in this minimal version, we can see that segmentation is happening. We can see that we can distinguish these different textures. So let's see. This is kind of the combinatorics of texture recognition. This is sort of all possible textures and the fact that we can easily recognize the repetition of these textures. We can easily recognize that these are repetitive patterns. When we get to nested patterns, sometimes we can easily recognize nested patterns. Other times, it's a little bit harder to recognize. That one is a perfect nested pattern, but yet it's a little harder to recognize. So when we have repetition, our visual system does a pretty good job of just sort of saying that's a repeat. But when we have a nested pattern, our visual system sometimes will do very well, and sometimes will do quite poorly. Okay, so these are examples of where we're sort of approximating perfect randomness with different densities of black and white cells going down or across the page, I believe. This is essentially applying a cellular automaton rule. This is saying, if we take this and we filter it, do we get something that still looks random? Okay, so the point of this section on visual perception is to give sort of a characterization of what kinds of things, when we look at patterns like cellular automaton patterns, what will our visual system readily pick out as, oh, that's simple, and what will our visual system miss? What might be a true regularity, but our visual system misses it. And for that, we have to kind of have this model of the visual system. So I think there are quite a few notes in this section. I talk about color vision. I talk about how nerve cells work. I talk about the visual system and how there are different kind of feature detectors in the visual system. These are some typical kinds of receptive fields of essentially convolution functions that happen in the first level of visual cortex at the back of our brains. Then I talk about scale invariance in vision. That's something that's become very much discussed in the context of neural networks and convolutional neural nets and so on. I'm talking here about the fact that there is more or less scale invariance. Okay, I talk about history of vision research and various kinds of models that people have had for what we notice and various kinds of sort of primitives for texture that people discuss. This is commenting that even in prehistoric times, people, when they drew those first cave paintings, were drawing outlines more strongly than they were drawing the interior. This notion of edge detection is a very basic one to our visual perception, and that's sort of why sketches and cartoons and things like that can work. Talking here about which of these can you readily recognize as different, and which do you confuse? And that's sort of part of this question of sort of what are the elements of texture? Okay, other texture perception stuff. Right, this is things like I talk about Photoshop and the fact that sharpening and edge detection are now on general purpose computers. And in those days, Wolfram language did not yet have, when the book came out in 2002, we were just beginning to put image processing as direct built-in features of Wolfram language. So this section would have lots of different notes nowadays. With things like mathematical morphology, we've had implemented very nicely in Wolfram language for a long time now. But I'm just mentioning that here. I'm talking about, okay, we talk about camouflage. That's kind of an interesting thing. I say rather dryly, on both animals and military vehicles, it is often important to have patterns that cannot be distinguished from a background by the visual systems of predators. And in most cases, it's presumably best achieved by avoiding differences in densities of certain local features. So in other words, a related situation, almost any fairly random overlaid pattern containing many local features can essentially be used and successfully be used to mask the contents of a paper envelope. You see that used quite often in practice. All right, a lot of other things I discuss in the section on visual perception. One is half-toning. I was very familiar with this because of issues in printing the book. This is the question of when you are trying to show something as gray, but you only have black and white pixels, what can you do? And this is kind of filling in the gray levels. And this is its own kind of simple system, a bit like a cellular automaton, that fills in the pixels by sort of going across in scan lines and just sort of filling it up. And when you've reached the right number of pixels in your buffer, then put down a black pixel. And what's interesting about this is different forms of half-toning give different kinds of sort of phantom patterns in an image. So you thought you were getting uniform gray, but actually you get this very regular array, and our visual system can tell that. And so this question of under what circumstances can you make half-toning so that our visual system will just say, oh, there's nothing there, it's featureless, it's just gray. Clearly, in this case, this does better at that than this down here, where you can see those large-scale features. So that's sort of an interesting test case for visual perception, is when can you do half-toning without bringing up sort of features that aren't there. Okay, this is about texture generation. Oh yeah, moire patterns. That's a fun case. That's is there really a pattern here? So, you know, you take different, you take sort of lines or dot arrays, and you can see there that these dot arrays have some elaborate sequence of patterns that are produced just by the interaction of those dot arrays. Same here, and depending on the angle, you get different levels of visibility of things. And what I discuss here is the sort of continued fraction analysis, which I did to understand when you get recognizable features. This is sort of, again, a test of visual perception. There's, in a sense, nothing really there. It's just two dot arrays, but we perceive there as being these kind of rosettes. This has been analyzed by people at our summer school more recently, and I think some nice work has been done, maybe even some papers published about this. Okay, that's a fun issue. That in writing this book, it was non-trivial to find graphical representations that actually work for the human visual system. For example, one of the reasons the book wasn't in color, apart from the fact that it would have been too difficult and expensive to print at that time, at least, is that one of the things I knew was that when you have an array of let's say, red and green cells, the way that our visual system works, you can get, just by a pattern of red, green, and black cells, for example, you can have what appear to be different colors, even though they're really just made from red and green, but they stand out as different colors just because of features of our visual system. So you end up with these patterns that are very confusing, because it's like, that was supposed to be a 3-color pattern, but it looks like it's a 5-color pattern because there's some additional color, not just a gray level, but an additional color that shows up just as a result of visual perception. And so that was one of the confusing things I wanted to avoid. Okay, let's go back to chapter 10. And our next section here is on, let's just take a look at what we've got here. Oh, okay, let me, our next section is about auditory perception. And I talk about the way we hear sounds by vibrations of the hair cells in our inner ears, and the fact that what we're really hearing is the frequency spectra of things. And so the question is, for these systems produced by simple rules, what are their frequency spectra? And here's a surprising thing. These nested patterns, you might say, well, they'll have simple frequency spectra. Well, some of them do, but some of them absolutely do not. So you get some nested patterns that have essentially discrete frequency spectra and some that have continuous ones. So if you're like listening, you can tell a pure tone easily. That's, a single frequency is very easy to tell. For example, one question is, can you hear nestedness? And the answer is sometimes you'll hear it as a small number of pure tones, but sometimes it's a big complicated mess. And in fact, our auditory system is not well set up to hear nestedness. I tried many experiments on this. Okay, this is talking about frequency spectrum from random block concatenation. Let's see. And I think I probably have some notes here. I was quite interested in the question of, things like chords. And here's a question, there's some chords that sound better than others. Things like, a major fifth sounds good. That's a 3/2 ratio of frequencies, or an octave factor of 2 ratio of frequencies sounds good, but there are other chords that don't sound good. And so I was really curious, how could I tell what our auditory system is picking up that makes chords sound good and bad? And I had kind of a simple hypothesis that I think is actually quite good and interesting, which is that when you have two notes that have a certain difference from each other, there will be harmonics generated of those notes. If you just look at the collections of harmonics and ask how many numbers with small denominators do you get from those ratios from all those different harmonics added up, you end up realizing that there are particular frequencies that are kind of in which in which there basically aren't small ratios. There aren't things that there are never small ratios of frequencies for certain ratios of frequencies, for certain chords you can play. You end up with essentially you end up by combinations of those notes and their harmonics and their integer multiples, give frequencies that go into a range of maybe 15 hertz that sounds like a kind of grating noise. And the sort of hypothesis is that that's why those kinds of chords sound rather unpleasing to us. Anyway, that was just a thing that I analyzed. It's one of the notes that had a lot of content to it and took a lot of time to figure out. It's talking about sounds based on musical scores. Subsequently, we built the Wolfram Tones website based on these ideas of essentially taking cellular automata and rendering them as musical scores. Talking about sound compression, let's not go into that here. This was kind of the non-trivial mathematics of the frequency spectra of nested patterns. It's one of those things that's kind of just on the edge of being reachable by traditional mathematical methods, just on kind of the edge of computational reducibility, but still very difficult to do. I talk about sequences of flat spectra. Sometimes these are used for diffusers. You see these weird shaped diffusers in like concert halls and things. These are usually set up to be these number theoretic functions that produce a flat frequency response. Okay, this is just more details. Okay, this is for cellular automata. This is the frequency spectra that you get for cellular automata, including all kinds of complicated peaking for rule 110, and sometimes just very simple smooth curves for things like this that are just sort of random sequences of blocks put together, and so on. And rule 30, its frequency spectrum is in a sense very simple. It seems like it's uniformly random. This is an example of where there's randomness but not complexity, and this is a case where there's complexity too. even the frequency spectrum is not kind of summarizable by just saying, oh, it's flat and random. Okay, 2D spectra. I talk about diffraction patterns. Okay, all right, and we're on to the next section here. All right, let me try, and I'm going to go through this a little bit faster maybe. This one is about statistical analysis. It's like, okay, you've got rule 30 and you've got this complicated pattern. Surely you can just be a statistician and say that pattern isn't really as complicated as you think. There's sort of a question of what really is statistics, and what kinds of models in effect does statistics deal with. And this is talking about probabilistic models saying, oh, we have something which with some probability which goes black and then it's always white, and then it has some probability to go on the white path here or on the black path here. These are Markov models. This is sort of a standard probabilistic kind of model for, these are even hidden Markov models actually, standard models for these systems. And so then we can ask, well, can we statistically reproduce the behavior of, for example, a cellular automaton? Can we make, and can we do that by saying, well, forget about the precise rules that were followed, just follow statistical rules, probabilistic rules. How close do we get in reproducing what the actual cellular automaton does? And so this is an example that shows actually there's a phase transition between one kind of behavior and another, depending on the probabilities that we assign to things. So that makes it difficult. This is a case where we're trying to make a sort of probabilistic approximation to cellular automata. And the question is, does that thing there that's got the right probabilities look like that thing there? Well, the answer is no, not really. It has the right probabilities, but it doesn't have the kind of large-scale structure that one needs in the cellular automaton. So a probabilistic approximation to a cellular automaton is not going to work that well. What is this? This is about, this is about frequencies of block frequencies. It's about kind of how you characterize a pattern in terms of frequencies of blocks. And whether we can recognize things as random or not. So in a sense, when we say we're going to use a probabilistic model to represent the cellular automaton, we're saying that with some method of analysis, it's going to look okay to have let's see. Yeah, right. It's going to look okay to have processed our data by some kind of filter, and we're still going to have something which kind of looks like the original data. Okay, so one question is, let's say, well, actually, let me put it a different way. One question for statistics is, you take some data, you apply some rule to it. Like you say, let's calculate the average number of black and white cells, or let's calculate the lengths of runs of black and white cells. Each one of those tests, you could say, does it come back saying that the result is just like it would if every bit was picked at random? So average number of black and white cells. If every bit was picked at random, we would expect that to be 50%. Does that come back as 50% when we run it on a particular sequence that we're studying, like the center column of rule 30? Similarly, if our test is, what's the distribution of lengths of runs of black and white cells, that has a certain form if the underlying data is perfectly random. And the question then is, does it come back from rule 30 saying, yep, it looks perfectly random or not? So you can go on and you can make a whole battery of statistical tests. And there are some standard ones that are used for random number generators. I talk about them in the notes, in the NKS notes. Here, there's probably the note here about tests of randomness. There's some sort of a standard sequence of maybe, these are 8 of these, permutation tests and blocks of elements. Possible orderings of values should occur equally often. That's just one random example of a statistical test. But so we're doing these tests and we're saying, if we apply this test, will it show us up as being obviously non-random? So in previous examples here, we saw that there were, for example, methods of compression, which would take any nested pattern and immediately say, oh, that pattern can be crushed down to something much smaller. It's obviously not random. That method of that statistical test has kind of shown non-randomness here. Okay, so what's a kind of principled way to think about this? Well, a thing we could do is to say, let's enumerate all possible statistical tests. How will we do that? Well, we can do it because we can enumerate all possible programs. And we can basically treat every cellular automaton as a statistical test. So across the page here, we've got different initial conditions. And down the page, we're running cellular automata as statistical tests. So here, we're running Rule 60, and we're saying, just take that initial condition, run Rule 60, what do you get? So in this particular case, we readily see that it says, oh, no, that's not random. It produces an all-white Rule 60. Here, we've also got some, oh, that's not random. It produces a very non-typical Rule 60 pattern. But what we see is, for different rules, we see kind of more and less success in being able to determine, after we've used the rule as a statistical test, does that reveal the non-randomness of the original sequence? So this is sort of an interesting way to say, rather than just sort of arbitrarily saying, oh, statistics involves doing whatever statistical tests you feel like, this is saying, no, you can actually enumerate all possible statistical tests. Now, clearly, you won't get to all possible statistical tests because there will be statistical tests that require more and more computation to do. But what you can do is to say, let's take the shallow statistical tests, the ones that can be done by some small amount of computation, and let's just enumerate all of those and see what their consequences are. And once again, we can kind of look at what that means for whether something like Rule 30 is sort of cracked by that procedure. And the answer is it's not. We can't find a rule, at least I've never found one, that has the property that if you feed it the Rule 30 sequence, center column sequence, for example, it'll, just by the evolution of that rule, it will sort of crack it and show that it's non-random. I'd be very surprised if such a rule exists. It actually would be an interesting thing to prove. It's kind of one of the problems in our Rule 30 prizes from 2019 really talks about that as a possible method for solving that problem, is to show that there is no rule like a cellular automaton rule that will compress, that will successfully find non-random that sequence. Okay, so I have a whole bunch of things that I discuss here about complexity of models, linear feedback shift register sequences, all kinds of things about tests of randomness and so on. Okay, that's not a, but this is kind of going through sort of what the typical idea of statistics is and how we can use our simple programs as sort of meta models of statistical tests. And we can understand sort of what the role of statistics is. Okay, returning to chapter 10. Okay, so we've got a couple more sections here. The next one is about cryptography and cryptanalysis. So the question is, given Rule 30, can you, even if statistics doesn't get you anywhere, can you cryptanalyze this? If you were just given that center column, can you tell that that center column is not truly random, but just comes from this particular seed here? And if you change the seed, would you be able to invert the center column to just find out that it comes from that particular seed? Now, I actually proposed Rule 30 as a practical cryptographic system back in the early 1980s, and indeed it's seen some use for that purpose. It's a stream cipher. It's not a public key cipher. We put a lot of effort into trying to find public key ciphers based on cellular automata without great success to date. But Rule 30 is a good stream cipher. And how does that work? How do you use it as a stream cipher? Well, what you do is you say, here's my plain text. Here's the data that I want to encode. Let's say black, white. Here's the center column of Rule 30. And I know what the initial seed was for that center column. That's my key. I then generate the center column, and then I XOR, I exclusive OR that center column with my plain text, with my message, to get my resulting ciphertext. And if I want to go back from the ciphertext, this is the message I transmit, the encrypted message I transmit. If I want to go back from that to find out what the original message was, well, I just have to reproduce that quotes random sequence from rule 30 from the particular seed I'm using and XOR that with this to get back to the message. So that's the way that you would do cryptography, very straightforward way to do cryptography with the rule 30 pattern. So, okay, this is a very straightforward cryptographic system. This is a just running key crypto system that just runs through different, it's sort of a shift cellular automaton here. It runs through different sequences here to pick up what the key should be. And that's a rather easy, that was a thing that was broken in the 1500s or 1600s as a practical cryptographic system. Okay, here's another example of a cryptographic system. This is using rule 60. Rule 60 is an additive cellular automaton. And this is using the center column of this rule 60 pattern, where the rule 60 has been wrapped around in a finite sized register, using that to do encryption. Turns out this is a very practical encryption technique that was used. Linear feedback shift register was used as an encryption technique actually up until the 1950s by some countries. So the question is, can you break that encryption technique? In other words, is the sequence that you get here random enough that you can't deduce the seed, or could you in fact deduce the seed? Turns out this particular case, it's a total lose. You can absolutely break it. Once you can reconstruct, and you have to do that statistically from what you know about the structure of the plain text message, once you can reconstruct something about that sequence that you get out of the random quotes random generator, you just have to go and take that sequence and sort of run it sideways, take that, run the rule sideways, and you can deduce exactly what the initial condition was. So this additive cellular automaton, aka linear feedback shift register, is not in the end a secure crypto system, because once you have that key, that sequence, you can go back and deduce what the key was. Okay, this is essentially a way to understand that inversion of the rule 60 crypto system. Okay, what about rule 30? Here's our friend rule 30. Generating its center column being used as a cryptographic sequence. How does that work? Well, we can see whether we can reconstruct rule 30 from just its center column, whether we can reconstruct the initial condition. Turns out rule 30 has the property that if you go in one direction, you can successfully reconstruct it. If you go to the, I guess you're going to the right here, you can reconstruct it. But if you try to go, I may be getting this the wrong way around. The question here is, if you're given the center column, to what extent can you determine what the left-hand side actually was? And what this is showing is that you can get some information, but by just knowing the center column, but you can't deduce it all. If you have two adjacent cells in the center column, then you can indeed, and it's a pretty definite deterministic procedure, you can indeed invert it and go and find out what the left-hand side was. But if you're given only the pure center column and nothing else, you will not be able to do that inversion. And you can see here the extent to which that's even sort of statistically impossible to do. So let's see, we talk about, so the basic conclusion is that sort of the obvious methods of cryptanalysis won't crack rule 30. So in other words, even if our method for saying, oh, it's not really random, is to use cryptanalysis, we still will conclude, oh, actually, it really is random. So cryptanalysis is not enough to sort of break out of the computational irreducibility of rule 30. So I talk a bit about methods of cryptanalysis and linear feedback shift register sequences, how to do the cryptanalysis of a linear feedback shift register sequence, various techniques, various features of the cryptographic properties of rule 30, things about how quickly mixes up its keys and things like this. One terrible thing that happened with Rule 30 is somebody wrote a quite good book review of cryptography at some point, and they didn't understand that Rule 30 is not Rule 60, that the 30 and the 60 are different numbers. And so they thought Rule 30, oh, it must be cryptanalyzable using the same techniques as Rule 60, and that produced a huge confusion in the literature. Somebody should check the Wikipedia page whether it's still wrong. I think it occasionally gets made wrong as people look at this book and say, oh, it says that. Well, the book is just completely wrong. Maybe there's been an erratum to the book by now. But in any case, the Rule 30 is not Rule 60. Rule 60 is an additive cellular automaton that is quite easy to cryptanalyze. Rule 30, so far as we know today, cannot be broken as a cryptographic system. And this note gives a few details about its sort of performance as a cryptographic system. This talks about looking for other rules for cryptography other than Rule 30. That's actually something we've done quite a bit of. You can, in fact, our random number generator in Wolfram language now uses one of these other rules, which is a little bit more efficient at generating bits. And so a typical thing here is to use, well, I think I discussed in the NKS book, using rules that don't just look at a cell and its two neighbors, but look at cells more distant. I think the one we're now using as a random sequence generator just looks at more distant cells without looking at the neighboring cells. And that's just a more efficient way to kind of mix data up. Okay, what's this? This is a nonlinear feedback shift register, very similar to one of our, to something like Rule 30, but not quite the same because of the way the boundary conditions work. There's a description of that. Okay, this is about more technical things about how to try to do cryptanalysis in cellular automata by using backtracking. And in the end, the conclusion is it doesn't work. There's a question of deducing the rule for a cellular automaton given an array of black and white cells. If you can look precisely at every cell, it's quite easy to deduce the rule. You just have to fit the template in a few times and you'll see all the cases that occur. Linear congruential generators. Okay, other kinds of cryptographic methods like using digits of pi or digits of a square root. Talking about NP completeness, talking about factoring integers. These are all sort of examples of that's the actual time it took Wolfram language to factor integers of different sizes, samples of integers of different sizes. Back in those days, it's probably a little different now because the algorithms have changed a bit. But we see kind of the fact that on average, it's increasing more or less exponentially, linearly on this logarithmic scale. Different kinds of cryptography. Again, just more about different kinds of number theoretically based cryptographic systems and their relationship to what I've talked about in the main text about cryptography and to what extent you can use cryptography as a way to kind of recognize regularities in something like the Rule 30 cellular automaton. Okay. Well, second to last section here is about traditional mathematics and mathematical formulas. Oh, actually, no, we've got three more sections here. This is actually a section that I've referred to many times. This is a section about kind of, well, what can math do? If you just want to say mathematically, what is the color of a particular cell? That's sort of the tradition of a lot of natural science, is to say, give me a formula for what's going to happen. Okay, so can we give a formula for what the color of a particular cell in the cellular automaton pattern is? In this pattern here, give me a formula for the color of a particular cell is rather easy. We just have to look at the coordinates for that cell, and then we just have to do some modular arithmetic, and we get the answer of whether it's black or white. Okay, let's keep going, and let's see whether there are other kinds of cases where there is an easy formula. Okay, what about a nested pattern like this? Well, it turns out there is a rather easy formula to tell you what the color of a particular cell is here, although it makes use of the digit sequences of numbers. So what it does is it says, if you look at the digit sequence of the x coordinate and the digit sequence of the y coordinate, and then you take kind of those corresponding digits of the X and Y coordinates, and you compute like the exclusive OR. Is only one of them black, or only one of them a 1, only one of them a 0, and you compute from that what the result is, then essentially from that, you can figure out whether this square will be black or white. More specifically, you can use this finite automaton to basically go through and say, given each column in this, what was the X coordinate, what was the Y coordinate, what was the digit of the X coordinate, the digit of the Y coordinate, you just follow this finite automaton, and it will tell you in the end whether for that pattern of for that pair of coordinates, whether the cell will be black or white. So the basic point is, if you just know where you are as a digital number, then it's very fast to just whiz around this finite automaton and say what color of cell you're going to get. So this is an example of a nice computationally reducible pattern where, given just a position in the pattern, you can readily say what the value is going to be. And these are the finite automata that do the same thing for these patterns here. This is the slightly more complicated finite automaton that's needed to determine the color of a particular cell here in this like Rule 150 like pattern. But the basic point is, there is a sort of quotes mathematical like formula that, given the coordinates, will give you the color of the cell for a nested pattern. Okay, and then I talk about sort of the mathematics of nested patterns, and I point out that, for example, for Rule 90, the standard Sierpinski picture, the actual things you get correspond to the Pascal's triangle mod 2. And that corresponds to binomial coefficients, just the coefficients of binomial of expanding 1 plus x to the n. In the case of Rule 150, there's again a formula, but now it's a Gegenbauer polynomial, a slightly more elaborate kind of mathematical function, not just a binomial coefficient. But that's sort of a, math can reach it, so to speak. Okay, that's showing Pascal's triangle. That's showing the fact that you can just compute this with integers, and if you take the integers mod 2, you'll get this pattern. Same thing is happening here, where you don't have quite Pascal's triangle, you have a trinomial coefficients pattern, where each particular number is the sum of the 3 numbers above it, rather than just the left and right neighbors. But again, these are sort of cases where there is a sort of mathematical way to work out kind of the color of a particular cell. So what are some other examples of that? Here's one other example. This is a GCD-based example. So let's imagine that our rule just looks at the superposition of these patterns where you have cells 1 apart, 2 apart, 3 apart, etc. You get this pattern here. Okay, so you can say, can you predict, just by knowing the coordinates, whether you will have a black cell or not in that particular position? And the answer is, well, yes, you can. In fact, this is just the pattern of whether the 2 numbers, the X coordinate and the Y coordinate, are relatively prime. It looks visually complicated, but mathematics allows us to crack this picture. So we might visually say, oh, there are aspects of this picture that look kind of random, but we know that mathematics with relative coprimality allows us to just crack the pattern and immediately say whether a particular square will be black or white. So that's a case where mathematics goes a little bit further than our visual system succeeds in going. It's rather rare in that respect. Usually our visual system does better than most mathematics is able to do. But that's a rare case that I was able to identify where our visual system doesn't do so well and where we can use mathematics to resolve the answer. There's one more example of that. This is powers of 2 in base 3. So I'm sorry, powers of 3 in base 2. Turns out that that pattern of digits is actually a local pattern of digits made by a cellular automaton. So imagine that we had a cellular automaton. It's a particular cellular automaton that, for example, corresponds to this here. Then it turns out that that cellular automaton, even though we might have constructed it just as a cellular automaton, turns out to be generating the powers of 3 in base 2. So we can see down here how that works. There's just a rule that corresponds to these multiplication tables. I'm sorry, I should have said powers of 3 in base 6, not base 2. Powers of 3 in base 6. just corresponds to a cellular automaton pattern. So powers of 3 and base 6, even though that pattern looks kind of random, it's still the case that that to know the nth row of it, it's really just a question of knowing what's 3 to the power something or other in base 6. And it turns out that when you are computing powers of things, you might think, oh, to compute the nth power, you just have to take the thing, you multiply it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, until you've multiplied it n times. But that's not true. There's a much more efficient way of computing high powers by repeated squaring. You compute, the 5th power, maybe by just going one at a time, but then to get to the 10th power, you just have to square that. You just have to multiply the 5th power by the 5th power again. And you keep doing that, and you can take any number, and it's basically the binary decomposition of the exponent gives you the sequence of repeated squarings and multiplications that you need to get that number. And that takes much less. It takes the logarithmic time to do that repeated squaring. And so that's sort of a more efficient way to compute the answer. So that's a case where we have a pattern that, again, looks kind of random to our visual system, but mathematics manages to crack it more efficiently than just the sort of irreducible run each step and see what happens. Okay, so what other methods do we have for kind of cracking these programs? Another one is that we can say, well, let's think about rule 30 or rule 90 or any of these cellular automata as a Boolean function. So what it's doing is it's taking each value here is in the case of rule 90, it's the left cell XOR the right cell. Or if we write that out in terms of pure and or not, it's a slightly more complicated formula here, which tells us, well, in fact, this is the final formula, A1, A3 bar, plus A1 bar, A3, that formula is the operation of rule 90. So we can see in terms of and or not, that's rule 30 there. It's a rather simple formula. So now the question is, what happens if we run for several steps? If instead of running for just for one step, we say, what is the effective formula that we get after we run rule 90 for let's say 2 steps? Okay, still rather simple. If we run rule 30 for 2 steps, the formula is much more complicated. Let's keep going. Here are the results for running, let's say, rule 30 for up to 5 steps. That is the simplest Boolean function that gives you 5-step rule 30. This was pretty hard to compute back in the 1990s. Now there's a function Boolean minimize in Wolfram language, which just nails this very, very quickly. And it's hard to know that you really got the minimal example. I think this one is the minimal example, though. So what we see here is that for something like rule 90, which generates a sort of obviously visually simple pattern, this Boolean function doesn't get much more complicated as you go successive steps. But in rule 30, and this is kind of a sign of sort of computational irreducibility at work, in rule 30, you are producing kind of this long sequence of the Boolean functions that you get rapidly, progressively more complicated. And that's kind of a sign that the visual complexity cannot be cracked by using some Boolean function kind of mathematical method. Okay, this is in terms of NAND. This is the actual true minimum in terms of NAND. This was very hard to compute. Most Boolean minimization is done in terms of DNF, for example, the destructive normal form, just 2 levels, ands of ors. This is asking if you make the function that you want purely out of NAND, what pattern of NAND gates produces the function you want? Actually, this would be a fun thing to follow up on. This took some computational effort, but I'm sure it could be done better now. This is again asking, if you look at these different rules, like rule 90 after 2 steps, it's still a fairly simple collection of NAND gates. Rule 30 after 2 steps is already a much more complicated collection of NAND gates. And I have no doubt that if you go to successive steps, if that was computationally accessible nowadays, that you could get further. And that you would see that this thing just is of rapidly increasing complexity. Okay, let's take a look at some of the the notes for this section. I think there are lots of notes. Oh boy, I'm not going to talk about all of these. I talk about empirical mathematics. I talk about difference tables, and let's click through a bunch of these. Oh, this is fun. This is just another way of generating patterns using digit operations. This is there's a lot more that could be done on this. Just interesting looking patterns that are a little bit related to context-free languages applied to these kinds of rules. This is asking the question, when you say something is representable by mathematics, what do you mean? What is the notion of a sort of mathematical function? You know, there are named functions, there are plus and times and things like that, but what about the gamma function? What about the polylogarithm function? When can there be a named function? It's basically when you get to reuse the same sort of packet of mathematical information many times. Additive rules in 2D, continuous generalization of additive rules. This is a complicated thing that I didn't really ever figure out. This is the sort of analytic continuation of those rules to arbitrary real values or complex values, and you see that these things that were represented in terms of binomial coefficients or Gegenbaur polynomials, they are the binomial coefficient case generalizes quite nicely to the continuous case to produce these. What are these? These are these sine function curves, but the Gegenbaur polynomial for the trinomial coefficients is a big mess in when one tries to continue it, and it sort of makes these arbitrarily fine details in that case. More on nested functions, more on the structure of the GCD array, a bunch of results that were really hard to get, like certain aspects of randomness in that pattern that I studied empirically, really hard to get. They might be easier on a modern computer, but you know, they were just a note in the NKS book here, but those numbers were really hard to get. They took a lot of CPU time to get, but I didn't have notes to the notes, so I didn't get to say things like that. This is about computation of powers, complex powers. The fact that, okay, this is an interesting case. So the question is, that's repeated squaring method. What's the most general class of system that allows you to do that? It turns out that additive cellular automata are like dealing with integers. They have kind of a repeated squaring method of computing their behavior. So whenever you can do repeated squaring, you can compute behavior much more efficiently than just by going through each step. When can you do repeated squaring? This is kind of an interesting piece of mathematics that I think I really kind of nailed down here, that has to do with what properties functions have to have in order to allow that kind of repeated squaring method. It's not known what the most general class of such functions is, or when the things you're describing can be talked about in sort of standard human forms, like in terms of integers or bit patterns or something like that. So this is a case of what is the most general situation in which you can do this kind of reducibility. Okay, that's interesting. I was just thinking about things related to this very recently. Okay, Boolean formulas, DNF minimization, sizes of Boolean formulas. Okay, this has to do with how big the Boolean formulas are for different cellular automata at different numbers of steps, and what the chance is that a cellular automata needs a big Boolean formula to compute it. In other words, sort of how complicated in terms of Boolean formulas are different cellular automata. This is about, okay, multi-level. Okay, this is about asking, if you look at all possible 2 to the 2 to the n input Boolean functions, what can you say about how representable they are in terms of things like nans? This is, again, something which deserves further investigation. But I started this investigation in the NKS book. More about cellular automata and nans, binary decision diagrams, another representation of Boolean functions, and something about the history of Boolean functions, and about reversible logic. That's 2-to-2 logic of the kind that's used lots in quantum circuits these days. This is a sort of elementary description of that. Continuous systems, yeah, this complicated story of when you can make, when continuous iterations, like iterated maps on an interval, when those generate things for which there is a formula for the result. Okay, back to the main text. I have a section here. So that was talking about sort of what mathematics can do in kind of cracking something like Rule 30. I have a section about human thinking and kind of describing what's a good meta model for human thinking. And basically, I describe the importance of memory and the importance of kind of pattern matching based on memory. And it's kind of an operational description of what one knows, what happens in things like neural nets. But it's basically talking about kind of the operational effect of having something which kind of can remember, can recognize a pattern that it's seen before. At the time when I was writing this, well, I had studied neural nets back in the beginning of the 1980s. We certainly didn't know all the things we know now about deep networks, and we didn't know how much we would succeed in training deep networks. The question that we can ask, though, that this is the general question that's being asked here, is, okay, imagine we have a model of human thinking that today might be a deep learning neural network. Can that crack what's happening in one of these cellular automata from simple rules? So I have a whole description here of neural net models and how those work, and I kind of enumerated different neural net models as I enumerated different possible cellular automata, looking at very simple neural net models. Again, something that could be looked at in more detail today. Future machine thinking. Okay, that was when there wasn't, the name machine learning wasn't really a thing back 20 years ago. I talk about different kinds of human memory, child development, the what we store in human memory. Again, always trying to get at this question of to what extent can we sort of crack a pattern that we think is random by using kind of human thinking type techniques. I think I talk about, oh boy, I'm talking about context-free languages here, the way that we set up human languages, just another kind of, all these different methods for representing kind of things that involve thinking. And this is a description of kind of what I would now call computational language and the extent to which the raw language has this particular context-free form, and to what extent it's possible to learn. We can learn language, but we can learn language because it has certain kinds of regularities. Could we learn sort of a language based on Rule 30? Well, probably not. And we can kind of tell that by looking at the sort of common regularities that we see in human languages. And I'm talking a little bit about that here. Brain teasers. Could we, if we were given Rule 30 as a brain teaser, could we solve it? The answer is basically no. Questions about generation of randomness by humans. And this is a section about game theory. It's another kind of model of sort of, can we, okay, we can't figure out what's happening, but maybe we could sort of, if we were forced to play a game against Rule 30, we would figure out how to win against it. Well, I don't think so. But this is kind of an interesting thing because people have studied kind of, for example, the evolution of games, but typically they haven't really been concrete about thinking about in what space of strategies do you evolve. In the kind of NKS approach, you can be completely concrete about that. You can say a strategy is described by a simple program, like a cellular automaton. What happens if you play one cellular automaton against another? Then what happens if you play one against another with some kind of learning rule and so on? But this is showing the sort of who wins against who in a contest between one cellular automaton rule and another. So for example, 34 versus 91, you see that at the beginning they're neck and neck, and then I don't remember which one of those it is that's losing here. One of them ends up losing here. And we kind of see that as we play repeated games of 33 versus 92, we see different behavior happening. And this is capturing that. So this is, again, another way to kind of get at this question of, how do we detect non-randomness? How do we detect that there is a simple underlying rule to one of these systems? Okay, the final section here of chapter 10 is a section that I've really returned to, actually, in some ways in recent times. It's a section called Higher Methods of Perception and Analysis. In other words, right now, we've got our eyes and our ears and our mathematics of the year 2002 when this was written. But what about the future? What might we be able to perceive or analyze in the future? Might there be a set of, might there be some alien who would look at Rule 30 at the center column of Rule 30 and say, no, that's not random. I can immediately tell that that comes from a simple rule. Might that happen? Is there a way to crack these things that is based on some sort of higher form of perception and analysis? And that's what I talk about here. I'm kind of describing, this is sort of a run-up to the discussion of computational irreducibility in chapter 12, just sort of a discussion about the different forms that higher perception and analysis could take. And the fact that, again, in chapter 12, I'll discuss the relationship of this to things like extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, here I'm simply talking about different forms of perception. I should look at this again now, because we're just about to look at this again for kind of observer theory. Different forms of perception for different that exist, for example, taste and smell and all these kinds of things that, in the earlier parts of this section of this chapter, I've talked about visual perception, auditory perception, and so on. But the question is, could you smell your way to Rule 30, for example, even if you couldn't see your way to it? And the conclusion is no, but you have to kind of do some kind of analysis and simplified models of actual olfactory perception and so on. Could evolution succeed in learning how to predict data, how to predict Rule 30, even if sort of from a standing start we can't do it? Maybe over the course of time, evolution would learn to predict. I don't think so. This is another issue. This is the question of, could we learn just by seeing Rule 30 everywhere? I mean, for example, every time I see a Rule 30, I know it's a Rule 30. I have had imprinted, I think it's something might have burnt out some small part of my brain, the fact that I really have it firmly imprinted. This is a Rule 30 pattern. And I don't even have to look at every detail of it. It's interesting, at one of our first summer schools, we did an experiment with an early eye tracking system, what people looked at in cellular automaton patterns. People who were sort of picked off the street, they would look at the whole pattern. People who'd been through our summer school, they only looked at the top of the pattern because they were used to looking at things like cellular automaton patterns where you could kind of know roughly what was going to happen just by looking at the top. So in a sense, as we expand our domain of perception and analysis, what we count as non-random will gradually change. What I would say in our modern terms is we think about rulal space and the space of all possible rules for making things. As we expand our sort of domain in rulal space, our way of attributing other rules to things, we will gradually have a different conclusion about, for example, what is random and what is not. And I think that was it for chapter 10. So just sort of summarizing here, that the big idea is, how do we apply perception and analysis to the kinds of patterns we're generating with simple programs? And what are the processes of perception and analysis that we can use? And how do those work? And so the and can we make kind of meta models for those processes of perception analysis? And I suppose the main conclusion of this section is Rule 30 really is somehow irreducible. You can pick at it with all these different methods. visual, auditory, cryptanalysis, statistical, mathematical, and none of them crack it. And that's kind of an important run-up for the discussion of computational irreducibility, which we'll have in chapter 12. Okay, so that's the story of chapter 10, and I have just a few minutes here to look at some of the questions that have come in, or comments. Okay, there's a question from Architect, or do people see chaos and randomness as the same? That's a thing that I addressed in considerable detail in chapter 7, about sort of the sensitive dependence on initial conditions versus other sources of randomness. The answer is people have gotten very confused about this, but there really is a distinction that can be made about whether the randomness is sort of intrinsically generated in a system or whether it comes from sort of excavating the initial conditions. Okay, William asks, how is compression possible at all in the universe? Well, it can be the case that while every detail of what happens may be irreducible, it can still be the case that if all we care about is where do the cars go, or where do the elephants go, we don't have to work out the detail of how every quark inside every atom in every piece of elephant, how that works. It's enough to just talk about the elephant. And so then we can use all sorts of compression to say we're making a model where we just talk about the thing we care about and not all the rest of the universe. How does one, RBS asks, how do you implement an observer in a simple program? Well, that's something we're really looking at again right now. In the case of the NKS book, I just had a very simple idea of just saying, you just take something like a cellular automaton, you use that to process the data, and then you use something which looks at the output and says, sort of, did that cellular automaton with its filtering produce something that I can readily recognize as this or that? But we're going to have, I hope, a more satisfactory version of that. William is asking, why does lossless compression work? Right. So why does lossless compression work? It works because not all strings are equally probable. And that's a complicated thing in our model of physics, because in the Roolead, in some sense, lossless compression couldn't possibly work for the whole Roolead. But what it can do is, if we take a particular slice, that slice will have a non-typical selection of possible strings. And so we can expect lossless compression to work there. But if we've said we want to get the whole thing, no, lossless compression can't work, because we've got everything going on there, and you can't sort of losslessly compress everything. You can only losslessly compress when you've got this mismatch of some things are more likely than others. Prutz asks, when perceiving sound, are there animals that can perceive phase differences? Actually, we perceive some amount of phase information. That's part of sound localization, is the relative phase of the sound in our two ears. I don't know whether there are critters that can do better than that. We're kind of doing basic sort of phased array type work to figure out, did the sound come from there or there? Now, there's other information that we get from the shape of our ears and how the sound comes from above and in front and behind and so on, but we're definitely using some phase information there. Let's see, cryptography, RBS says, is always reducible. Well, if you know the key, you better be able to reproduce the original plain text. Otherwise, your cryptography is broken. But the question is, if you don't know the key and you're trying to do cryptanalysis, how do you do it? And I don't really have a very principled way to think about that problem. I suppose I would imagine starting to enumerate programs and sort of just running them like we did with the statistical programs and seeing what happens. But I don't really have a good understanding of how you would do, in a sense, that's the general problem of can you find a regularity is the same as the general problem of cryptanalysis. Actual methods of cryptanalysis, well, they tend to be based on things like, if you have no in plain text, you can do certain things. If you have statistically reconstruct the plain text, knowing that it's in English or some other language or whatever, then you can use the statistical regularities of English to get yourself kind of a leg up that gets closer to knowing the plain text. Because plain text and the cipher text, you're kind of exposing what the sort of true key sequence for the crypto system is, and then it's a question of cracking that. But I don't really have a great. I don't know. I mean, the methods that are typically used are very ad hoc kinds of methods, or very brute force kinds of methods. That typically in modern times assume you know how the crypto system works. It's a quite different question if you don't know the mechanism of the crypto system from if you know the mechanism and you're merely trying to find the initial conditions. All right, well, I think we have run out of time here, but it was interesting for me to look back at chapter 10. I should have read this more carefully, actually, in recent times in connection with our work on observer theory. Something definitely to look at as part of that project. Always good to know that there are things that at least I understood 25 years ago or so. Most of chapter 10 was written, I think, in about 1997, 1998. It was, as I say, part of really its role in the research for the NKS book was to check the box of, is what you're seeing in the sort of complexity of things like Rule 30 just a glitch in our visual system, just an inadequacy of our visual system, or is it something deeper than that? And I think chapter 10 successfully answered the question, it's something deeper than that. It's not just about some detail of our visual system. Okay, well, we should wrap up there. Thanks very much. And next time we will be talking about the notion of computation, which is chapter 11. We'll be talking about lots of different kinds of computational systems and their relationship. So until then, thanks very much.